Okay, here we have a quick unboxing and my first thoughts on the Canon EOS 5DS-R. Now in the box you find the typical things that you find with any DSLR, except for a different accessory. Now in here you have the warranty card, the booklet, the battery charger, eyepiece, and this cable right here is a USB 3.0 with the actual cable locking device. And this is the actual body, the 5DSR. Very similar to the Mark III, except the indentation on the side near the release button along the edge right there, that groove is not on the Mark III. And the other difference is the Mark III is actually slightly heavier. The shutter is actually nicer to me on the Mark III, even though they lightened it up on the 5DSR. I personally, it feels like it has a little delay, which I kind of don't like, but I understand why it's there. And as you can see, the knob here doesn't have the chrome piece like the Mark III does. But this camera, as long as you know its functionality and its purpose, I think everything makes a lot of sense. And, you know, mainly tripod use, or if you do handheld, you just have to be a little more specific in how you handle things. And the purpose of the camera, I believe, is more for portrait, studio work, or landscape. The actual door here is the same SD card in the CF slot. I do notice that the 5DSR is a little harder to open, so it's like a tighter seal to it, I guess. 5DSR with the battery grip, the Canon brand battery grip. I recommend everybody with Canon specifically, make sure you get Canon brand batteries, Canon brand electronic, anything for it, especially the battery grip. I had problems before. And this is the cheap Canon 50 STM that I actually use for my C100 Mark II. And just to show you what it looks like mounted on here with the lens hood I just purchased, they just started making aftermarkets. And it looks pretty nice actually without the grip. It looks pretty well balanced, especially with the lens hood, since the actual filter thread is only 49mm. It looks like a joke actually. This is the actual locking mechanism here. You screw it in kind of like a PC cable for a monitor or old school monitor. This clip right here is pretty much what it does. Is you can actually plug in the USB 3.0, or you can plug in the HDMI cable, and this actually wraps the cord around so it doesn't get easily pulled and actually mess up the actual connection inside of the camera. Then you have bigger problems. I really like this idea, but the thing I don't like is I actually like to shoot with L brackets for Arca Swiss, and when you have the bracket on, whether it be with or without a grip, you can't actually apply this mechanism on here to actually be useful, because it just won't fit. If you do tether, I just don't know how this will work. If you're mounting it on a tripod, it just won't work at all. So these are just a couple quick up close shots just to get an idea what the body looks like. And like I said, if you're familiar with the Mark III, it's pretty much identical. One thing that nobody ever mentions for some reason is the actual color of the body is not black. The 5DS, to me, I have never seen the 5DS and the 5DSR together, so I can't really comment, but my experience with the 5DS, it was more noticeable. It's a very like grayish graphite type of color to it. It's definitely not black. The 5DSR to me looks a little more black, but it actually still has like a grayish tint to it, but it's definitely not black. Nobody ever mentions this anywhere for some strange reason, but it still blends it with my Canon brand battery grip. It's so close that you just can't tell that it doesn't match, especially with the R version. My first impression on this camera is I think it's really great. The low light performance isn't as sensitive as a Mark III, but if you understand, like I said, the purpose of this camera, that shouldn't affect you, because you shouldn't actually be shooting with this camera, in my opinion, at very high ISOs anyway, even if it's capable. So I think considering 50 megapixels and still being able to shoot at 1600 or even 2000, or if you wanted to go a little higher, but I personally wouldn't, I think it's not bad at all. The versatility of it, I think, is great, that you can shoot in large, or you can shoot in medium versions of RAW, or even small, where it's still equivalent to my megapixel output of my Mark III. So I think it has different crop modes and stuff like that for 1.3 or 1.6, where it kind of predetermines and shows you the crop line. And it has a lot of nice features that people, I don't think, are truly aware of. And a lot of people are giving this camera flack due to dynamic range and noise performance, but you have to understand what this camera is for. I remember when the Mark III first came out, the price was high at $3,600. And at the time, people who had Mark IIs, nobody could justify it. Everybody kept saying on paper it wasn't worth it. It was just a bad investment. But to everybody who actually went out and actually bought the camera, including myself, and used it, and who had experience with or without a Mark II, Really appreciated the upgrades. It's up to you to put value on how much that actually is worth to you. To me, it was. I do think it was a little costly, but at the end of the day, I never complained once I owned it. Now that with the Sony war and the megapixel war, Nikon, everybody's comparing, you know, these different brands together and saying that, you know, on paper it doesn't come with much. And I will say Canon does seem to be falling short with some of the feature sets, but also on the Canon C100 Mark II, and on paper it doesn't even shoot 4K, and it costs by itself more than every video camera that I own that shoot RAW and that shoot just higher resolution and 4K and stuff like that. So but the functionality of it is great, and once you actually own it and use it for yourself, you'll understand exactly why it costs the way it costs, and you have to put that value to it. Definitely do recommend it if you know what you're using it for. If you just want the latest and greatest gadget, and just because it's the highest megapixel, it doesn't mean it's the best camera, or it doesn't mean it's the best camera for you, and that's all you need to understand. So I hope that helps anybody out. Dynamic range, I will say it probably is slightly less just by eyeballing it compared to the Mark III, even though that's not even really a dynamic range machine itself. They look a little more dark, meaning a little more contrast output. It also gives a perception of a sharper image, and it also makes the image pop out a little bit more because of the harder edges. So it just has a slightly more finished look to it than maybe a Mark III does. That's not a bad thing. To me, that doesn't bother me at all, especially with doing something like portraits. Maybe for a landscape person or architecture, they may want a lot more dynamic range. It all depends how you're doing your scene. If you're a natural light shooter or a studio shooter. For me, I think it's perfectly fine. A lot of people didn't like the dynamic range of the Mark III either. A lot of people still shoot landscape, architecture, and portraits with it, and there's no problem. Unless you are comparing a camera or an actual shot with the same exact settings, same exact lighting, same exact environment, and you do two totally different bodies, is the only way that you'll really notice a lot of these differences, whether they're subtle or not. In the real world, nobody is taking two different pictures of the same image with two different cameras at the same time to compare and contrast. So if you get good images out of whichever brand you decide to use, do it. Nobody's going to care what you shot it with at the end of the day, unless they require it from a commercial gig and they want you to shoot with a certain spec camera, and that's pretty much it. So I hope this does help somebody out. I encourage anybody who's interested in this camera, put your hands on it first, use it, see if you like it by actually using it. Stop looking at the specs on paper. It doesn't mean everything. If you look at a car, there's plenty of cars that are V6s, but if you take a V6 from a higher sports brand or V8 versus another V8, even though they're both V8s, they're totally different. There's other things that go involved in that, not just that one thing. So just, you could have a cell phone that shoots 40 megapixels. It has nothing compared to a DSLR with half of those megapixels. If this was helpful at all, please hit like and subscribe. For more information, please visit www.howtoandreviews.com. Till next time.